What happens if I make my face too dark or too bright? You cannot see the details of my face clearly. But what if I do this? Now, hopefully, you can see me clearly. What I just did was balancing the exposure, which means I balanced the amount of light coming from my face to the camera sensor in a way that I'm saving all details. And this is simply what we need to do with all our photos when we are shooting. But the question is, how do I even know that the exposure is wrong? How do I know how to balance the exposure if it is wrong? Don't worry, it is very simple. You see, exposure is simply the amount of light reaching a camera sensor, and it is determined by a combination of three things: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. So, when we are talking about balancing the exposure, we are literally talking about balancing the values of aperture, ISO, and shutter speed in a way to get just the right amount of light and saving all details of the subject. But how do I know how to balance the values of these three things? Is there a relationship between them? Yes, there is. This relationship is called exposure triangle. Now, if you look at this triangle, it has three corners: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. And the middle part of this triangle represents the perfect exposure or the perfect amount of light that reaches the camera sensor. Now, if you change any of these three settings, you will have to adjust the other two in order to go back to maintaining that perfect exposure. So for example, let's say I am at f4 and I want to get a really sharp photo. So I will increase the f-stop or decrease the aperture to f8. Now my scene is very dark because obviously I'm letting in much less light. So what do I need to do? I will have to reduce my shutter speed or ISO to go back to maintaining that perfect exposure. Similarly, let's say I want to shoot motion blur, and to do that, I will have to reduce my shutter speed considerably, right? Again, I don't have that perfect exposure anymore. So what do I do? Now, this time I will have to either increase my aperture or ISO to go back to maintaining that perfect exposure. So you see what's happening here? The goal is to simply maintain that perfect exposure. And to do that, we will have to play with the settings of aperture, ISO, and shutter speed to maintain that same level. Now, this is all good to know, but the problem is still there. How do I even know that I have the right exposure? Can I use something to see that? And the answer is yes, by using an exposure meter. You see, every camera has it, and it looks like this. And its job is to tell you how dark or bright your photo is by moving that arrow on the horizontal bar to the negative or positive area. So if you're shooting in a dark scene, that arrow will move to the negative area, and if you are shooting on a very bright scene, that arrow will move to the positive area. Our job now is to set the aperture, ISO, and shutter speed in a way that that arrow moves closer to the center. This is how we can make sure that we have the perfect exposure. Let me demonstrate with an example. Now to demonstrate how we can balance the exposure using the exposure meter present in the camera, I have created a little setup for you. I am using this toy car as a subject, and I am using these toy trees in the background to complement this subject. This creates a proper foreground background scene, something that you would normally have outside when we click photos. So right now I'm at f2 and I have the lowest ISO value as possible, which is 125 for this camera. And according to the exposure meter, the arrow is on 0, which means I have the perfect exposure. So everything looks good. Now, although I have the settings to get the perfect exposure, there is, however, a slight problem. You see, my aperture is at f2 right now. However, I want to get a really crisp and sharp image, which is only going to happen between f5.6 and f8. This means now I will have to raise my aperture. So let's do that. Now, as I start increasing the f-stops, the arrow on the exposure meter starts going into the negative area. And as I reach 5.6, the arrow is now on -2. This simply means that I don't have the perfect exposure anymore. I have very less light coming in. And so to go back to that perfect exposure, I will have to change the values of either the shutter speed or ISO or both. Now, as I start decreasing the shutter speed, you can see that the arrow on the exposure meter starts moving towards zero. And as I hit shutter speed 15, the arrow is on zero, which means now I have the perfect exposure. There are, however, couple of things that we really need to keep in mind while balancing the exposure using the exposure meter. Firstly, avoid increasing the ISO as much as possible because it just creates too much noise in your photos. This can make your photos even unusable. Secondly, use a tripod for slower shutter speeds, otherwise, you will just get a lot of blur in your photos. So that's it. Now you know how to balance the exposure and get the right amount of light in your photos every time. All we need to do is to change the aperture ISO and shutter speed in order to bring that arrow on the exposure meter towards zero. That is all we need to do. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up. It really gives me encouragement to create content like this. Also, if you like this video, I think you will enjoy these videos also where I talk about the basics of photography. So check it out. I really had a lot of fun in making this video. I'll see you in the next one. Enjoy yourselves. Bye.